Hi, I'm Srikanth and I'm a developer in Rollbase. This demo will give a brief introduction about SAML and also how to configure SAML on Rollbase Private Instance. So I assume that you guys have a background about SAML, but anyhow, I'll be just giving a quick walkthrough. Before that, this is the Rollbase Private Instance which I have installed in my computer. Uh, this is the documentation of how SAML is to be configured. I'll be referring to the documentation and trying to set this up. And before we get to this, what is SAML? So SAML is a security assertion markup language. It is an XML-based open format for exchanging data uh, about authorization and authentication. So how does actually SAML work? So as you can see in this figure, uh, from SAML 2.0, we have the service provider initiated login, in which the user who is trying to log in contacts the service provider, which is Rollbase, and the Rollbase forms a SAML request to the identity provider. In the present demo, I'm going to take the identity provider to be Salesforce. So Salesforce can act as an identity provider. So the Rollbase will be the service provider and the Salesforce will be the identity provider. So when the user tries to log in into Rollbase, Rollbase makes a SAML request to the Salesforce IDP, and the Salesforce IDP checks if the user is present in Salesforce and gives an accordingly he gives a response in the form of an assertion to Rollbase, which helps us to log the user in. So if you can see in Rollbase, if you go to the setup home and you go to the authentication, you can see that there is an option for SAML/ADFS. So any customer can configure his authentication type to be SAML. So as we have multi-tenants in Rollbase, each tenant can have his own authentication. So this is how we set the authentication. But before we come to this, the admin of the Rollbase instance should do some one-time settings in order to enable SAML for his customers. So coming to the documentation, so it says configure the instance to enable SAML authentication. So before any tenant can configure SAML authentication details, a master administrator must perform this following tasks. So he needs to generate a signed certificate, Verizon, etc., or a self-signed certificate. For this tutorial, I'm going to generate a self-signed certificate uh, in order to configure SAML. So we can use the key tool to generate a self-signed certificate. If you're not familiar with the key tool, there are some online tools. I'll just go to a site DigiCert where we can just pop in some details and ask it to generate based on that. You can just copy paste your certificate generation command and you can use the uh, key tool. Once you press the command, it asks for the keystore password. Um, so So I entered the password for the generation of a keystore. So we can see that in the home folder, you can see that a key store is generated. So there is a progress.jks and progress.csr which is generated. So generating a key store is a essential part of configuring uh, SAML for Rollbase. So I'll take this key store file and place it in a folder in my desktop. Okay, so we'll get back to our documentation. So we generated a self-signed certificate and a key store for the public key. So we need to create the SP metadata file. So this SP metadata file gives information about uh, the SP, that is role base. Uh, so if you see, we have given an example of uh, how to configure the service provider metadata. So many guys are familiar with this SP metadata, and if you're not, just have a look at the documentation. We have an example SP metadata file to show how SP metadata should be generated. So the key points in the SP metadata file are the entity ID. So every entity, SP or IDP, will have an ID which recognizes its uniqueness. Uh, so we need to fill in this. And then another key information is the assertion consumer service URL. This is the location. This is where uh, we want our. This should actually be replaced by your uh, the place where you host your role-based instance. Anyway, these details are generated in the role-base itself. But when you can create this SP metadata file to be available to all your customers, and so if you see here, if you go to the authentication and go to SAML, we have this details for you. SAML login URL. This is the login URL the customer should use. This particular customer should use. His customer ID will be changing based on the tenant that is being using the role base. And the ACS URL is the URL which is supposed to be given to the IDP as the ACS URL. So this download SP metadata link will be useful when you need to give the SP metadata file we just saw. So we generated the signed certificate, we generated the key store, and we also had a look at the SP metadata. So you need to place the SP metadata in the Rollbase config directory, which is Rollbase home, pass instance, Rollbase config. So uh, this SP metadata file will give the customers insight into uh, about the SP metadata. So once we are done with putting the SP metadata file, we need to update the shared properties as follows. So now I'll be going to progress rollbase class instance config shared properties. So we can just copy paste this. So the sp key store file is the name of the sp key store we just downloaded. As you can see, it is progress.jks. So the key store password, just change it in our case. sp key store alias, by the command I gave it to be server, and finally the sp metadata file. So the name of the sp metadata file we created, you need to place a file in the config directory as I told before. So let it be sp metadata.xml. And this is not assertion, it is assertion consumer index. Make sure all these are equal to and not dash. So the assertion consumer index is the index in the IDP you want your URL to be configured. It's by default 0. You can just give it as 0. So once you're done with the properties, you're supposed to put the key store file inside the config directory. So once you're done with this, you can continue with the sixth point. If SAML authentication will be configured at the tenant level, provide the .cr and .crt files for the public key to the customer so they can configure SAML authentication details for their tenants. So you have the key store with you. Key store is nothing but a combination of private and public key. So you need to make sure to get a public key from the key store in order to give your customers the public key. So the admin who is putting the key store inside the role-based instance config should generate a public key of the form .cr and .cit and give it to the customers through mail or by speaking to them. So I'll just show you how to do that. So you can generate the public key from the key store by going to the location of the the key store and just opening the terminal there. I'm going to paste this command in the video below, but for you to understand what the command is, it is key tool minus export minus key store. Here we paste the name of the key store we have, which is .jks, and the alias we give it during the formation of the key store, which is server, and the name of the file saml.sir. So once you press this, it'll ask for the password, which is change it in my case. So the certificate stored in saml.sir. So you can see that there is a certificate created saml.sir, which is the certificate your customers should give to their respective IDPs. Say you have two tenants, the two tenants are putting SAML. So each tenant can have his own IDP. So to each of the IDPs, he needs to distribute this particular certificate. So we'll also go to the part where we configure the IDP. So then it will make things more clear. For now, the admin should do all this one-time configurations, generating the key store, generating the public certificate, configuring the SP metadata file and putting it in the config, and also updating all these properties. So once you're done with this, you can save this. We can go to the next part of our documentation, which is configuring SAML authentication details for a tenant. So as you can see, this screen is the screen we just saw. Uh, this is the authentication screen for the tenant. So a quick review about all the fields which are present. As you can see, there is a name field, which is the name for the SAML configuration you want to give. It can be any random name you want. And then there is the issuer. Your IDP has a unique ID. It's not the SP metadata file. It is actually the IDP metadata file. So it is the value of the entity ID attribute in the XML element and should be provided by the master administrator. So uh, just give me a minute. I'll make this clear for you. So every IDP has a metadata which describes different things about the IDP. So now we are using Salesforce as our IDP. So the Salesforce will give me a file which is made publicly available in the form of an XML, and it will have a unique ID named as the entity ID in its XML metadata. So we'll look at this. I'll show you with a actual IDP metadata file so that you can understand better. And then there is identity provider metadata. This field requires a file upload. This is where the actual metadata file comes from. You need to provide a IDP metadata file in the form of XML. All the IDPs generate this XML file. So then there is the service provider entity ID. So the service provider entity ID is the unique ID the role-based instance is having. So it's always better to give the domain name so that it will be unique. So in the IDP, you will be having to configure this service provider entity ID, which I'll show again in a minute. And then there is an attribute map. So a pipe separated mapping of the attributes in the form of integration name in role base is to attribute name sent from IDP. So the IDP sends various properties to the role base when it is sending the response. So you can actually configure what properties needs to be sent from the IDP to the role base. So once you formed a list in your IDP, you can map them to role based integration names, like a given name in my IDP should be mapped to the first name in my SAML role based instance. Similarly, the UID attribute which is being sent from from the IDP should actually match to the login name. This login name is a compulsory field, which is how we uniquely identify if the user is present in the IDP or not. So make sure you don't miss this, and it is mandatory to give at least two parameters. One being login name. You can give any other thing like the first name or last name, whatever attributes you want to set. Again, all these things will be clear when I go into the other part, that is the IDP section of configuring. But for now, just have an idea of what these attributes really are. So identity provider login. The URL the users of the tenant should be able to initiate SAML login. Uh, this is given in the IDP metadata file. Please ignore this SP metadata. It is IDP metadata. Similarly, here it is IDP metadata. And the logout URL. These all will be given in the IDP metadata file. So for now, I think you got an idea of what all these fields are. So let's dive into the IDP part of SAML now. So now we're back into the IDP part of things. So we have configured Rollbase to provide authentication by SAML. Now we have to set up the IDP. In this case, we are using Salesforce as an IDP. So Salesforce acts as an IDP for us to work on. So give me a minute. So there's my Salesforce account. So now I'll use the IDP feature of Salesforce to uh, make this act as an IDP for us. So we go to setup. Uh, so before this, you need to enable IDP settings in Salesforce to do whatever I'm doing right now. You can go through you can use this IDP or any other IDP. The way we set up things will be almost the same. In this thing, in Salesforce, we need to create an app. So we go to the apps. So create a connected app. So you go to new. So here you have how to create a new connected app. So if we come here, web app settings, this is where we have this enable SAML. So once I enable this, as you see, the entity ID is the entity ID of the SP, which is there uh, in our SP metadata file. I told it would be better if we gave the URL of the hosted. So what I'm giving is HTTP nbhide skasavage 7. This is my this is where I am hosting a Rollbase instance right now. So once I give this, we are supposed to give the ACS URL. So your ACS URL will be in this in your uh, screen. So you can just copy paste that. Actually, this will be the name of the machine we configure it to. So if you're configured on some xyz.com, so it will also show in the same way. So now we have the entity ID set, we have this ACS URL set. We have the name issuer is a role, an IDP specific thing, so it's already filled for you. You need not fill anything. And then there is encrypt SAML response. So upload a certificate and select the encryption algorithm is what they said. So this is where we upload our certificate, public certificate we generated. This is to ensure that our requests are signed and there is security which SAML assures us. So you take the encrypt SAML response, and then you should upload a certificate which we downloaded. If you remember, it is placed in the role-based config progress, role-based pass instance base config. So this is the certificate we are talking about. So once you upload the certificate, you're done with the configuring uh, your IDP. So this is the entity ID, this is the ACS URL, and this is the certificate which you're supposed to configure in the IDP. That is the reason we asked you to give the entity and ID and the ACS URL will be available to all tenants in the UI. So the administrator need not provide these, but the certificate which is supposed to be used for encrypting SAML responses, this is supposed to be communicated with the customers or all the tenants, and so that they can upload in their respective IDPs. Now I have configured it in Salesforce. Someone might configure it in one login, etc. So once this certificate is uploaded and we uh, connected app name, let us give some basic information like SAML demo. This. So we do this and save. We have a connected app in the name of SAML demo, which will give us all the, if you can see the entity ID, there is this encrypt. If you remember, the certificate we generated has all this stuff with it. So once this is done, we have set up our IDP. Now the tenant should configure his details by all the values he got here into the role base. So we'll jump right into that part.